Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your time, your interest, and most importantly, your support. With that, I'll pass the floor to Nathaniel.
Thank you so much, Ren. And wow, thank you to all of you for making this briefing and fundraising webinar this evening. We've got a lot of data to get to and a lot of information, and we want to leave lots of time for your questions. So let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Voter Project. And this evening, we're going to be going through the three things that you see here. First, I'm going to give a very quick introduction to our work at the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who are new to our work, please forgive me. I am not going to explain in detail everything that we do. If you are interested in an introduction to our work, Ren can share an introduction video link in the chat, and you can check that out. But tonight, we're not going to go through every aspect of our work, just a very quick introduction, so that we can spend lots of time on number 2 that you see here. And that is a deep dive into the voter file data that we've got about Arizona climate voters, and in particular, the opportunities presented to donors and volunteers this year. And then finally, we will have the Q&A session. As Ren mentioned, for those of you who just joined us recently, if you have a question this evening, please put it in the Q&A folder. Ren will answer some of your questions there in the Q&A folder. Some of them she won't. And don't feel like she's ignoring you. She's probably holding them so that she can ask me your question during the Q&A session. All right. Without any further ado, let's jump in to this introduction to the Environmental Voter Project that's going to go very, very quickly. In a nutshell, the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on just 2 things. One is identifying people who care deeply about climate and the environment yet don't vote. And 2 is then turning them into consistent voters. That's all we do. We find environmentalists who aren't voting, and then we turn them into better voters. So what that also means is we don't do a lot of the things that many other nonprofits do focus their time on. For instance, we don't lobby for particular policies. We don't endorse particular candidates. We don't even try to convince people to care more about climate change or the environment. In fact, a good way to think about our work is we're not in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. We don't want to do the hard work of trying to get people to care more about climate. Boy, is that hard. Instead, we want to focus on people who are already there. People who already care so deeply about climate or other environmental issues that it's their number 1 priority, yet they aren't voting. And then that enables us to make a purely behavioral intervention and spend our time trying to turn these climate-first non-voters into new voters and then into consistent voters. And as it turns out, although that might sound like a very narrow focus, it is extraordinarily impactful. And oh my gosh, are there a lot of people who fit that criteria. So for instance, even this year, the year of a presidential election, when the number of non-voters is at its smallest, because in a presidential year, turnout is at its highest, so non-voters, like the ones we are targeting, are their fewest. We have identified in the 19 states where we work, that you see right there, 4.8 million of these low propensity climate voters. And just to give you an idea of what we mean by that, low propensity climate voters, these folks are all already registered to vote. They're past that hurdle. 2, they are highly likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally listed as their number 1 priority over all other issues. And 3, they are unlikely to vote in this November's general election. And by unlikely to vote, we mean we have looked at their public voting histories, and we see that they did not vote in the 2020 presidential general election or any election since then. So if someone has that in their public voting history, we look at that and we say, you know what? I think they're unlikely to vote. I think they need a nudge. I think they need a really sophisticated mobilization campaign to make sure that they show up and vote because they're already registered and they already list climate as their top priority. We have individually identified 4.8 million of those people in the 19 states that you see here. The way that we go about doing our work, turning these non-voters into new voters into consistent voters, is as follows. And again, please forgive me if I breeze through some of this quickly for those of you who are just learning about the Environmental Voter Project right now. This is not meant to be an intro to EVP session. This is just a very, very quick overview. First step, identification. We work with data scientists to build predictive models on voter files, which allow us to individually identify these voters. And the way that we do it is we start by polling tens of thousands of people. And then we isolate the ones who tell us that climate's their number one priority. Then we work with these data scientists and we figure out, okay, what do we know about these people who just told us that climate's their number one priority? What behavioral and consumer data is there? What voter file data is there? What census data is there? And then we use that to try to find more people like them. And it's a long, iterative process. But at the end of it, what we are able to do is assign a score from 0 to 100 to every individual voter in a state's voter file, telling us how likely they are to list climate as their number one priority over all other voters, over all other issues. Now, what that leaves us with is a probabilistic model. But obviously, like, we can't talk to every single individual voter in the United States and ask them what their number one priority is. But the next best thing we can do is talk to tens of thousands of them, isolate the ones who list climate as their top priority, try to find people like them, and then test the accuracy of whether we're finding people who truly do list climate as their top priority. And every time we test these models, they are shown to be frighteningly accurate. And just so you know that we're not the only people doing this, this is now how the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign and very sophisticated Senate and congressional campaigns now target voters. So that's how we identify these climate first voters. And then it's really easy to just look at people's public voting history and say, okay, these climate voters typically vote in presidential elections. They don't need our help. They don't need a sophisticated turnout organization to talk to them. These ones don't vote. These ones do need our intervention. That lets us move to step 2, mobilization. Once we isolate these climate first non-voters, we then work with thousands of volunteers around the country to canvass, call, and send postcards to these voters. We as a staff also do direct mail and digital ad campaigns, all with behavioral science informed messaging that has been proven to increase turnout among these non-voting environmentalists. And I say proven because we run hundreds of randomized control trials. What these are is essentially we move some of these low propensity environmental voters into a control group and then never talk to them. And then after the election, we compare turnout in that group to the people we did talk to. And that way we're able to test which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists. And we've gotten really, really good at this over the past 7 years, such that we have fine-tuned which messages to give to which voters over which media. Step 3, habit reinforcement. We live behavioral science every day at the Environmental Voter Project. You likely don't, but you still probably intuitively understand that if you're trying to change someone's habits, like we are, you can't just parachute in once every 2 years and talk to them when there is a big, sexy federal election going on. That's not how you change long-term habits. And that's not what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. We work year-round. I know a lot of groups say that, but we truly do work year-round in every election, local, state, federal, primary, general, special, to try to improve these low propensity environmental voters' voting habits. And just to give you an idea of what I really mean by that, just this year, just since January 1st of 2024, we have already been active in 157 different elections. 157. And I guarantee you, the majority of those had nothing to do with climate or environmental policymaking. I freely admit that. But they had everything to do with changing people's habits. And our approach at the Environmental Voter Project is if you are in if you're in the business of trying to change people's voting habits, how dare you let an election pass you by without using it as an opportunity to talk to them? Because the simple truth is, the only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to get them to vote, So we really take that habit reinforcement seriously, because ultimately our goal is what you see at step 4, and that is to change the electorate. Yes, we have an enormous impact, and I'll show you very soon, on specific one-off elections. But our ultimate goal is not election specific. Our ultimate goal is to start changing the electorate in these states so that eventually we get so many climate first people to be showing up and casting their ballot whenever there's an election, federal, state, or local, that I don't care who's running for office. They're going to look at their polling data and they're going to look at their voter files and they're going to say, holy moly, where did all these environmental voters come from? Because if we can make that happen, that's when policy really starts changing. Because even in this hyper-partisan time that we live in, we have to recognize that there is still one thing that unites all Democrats and Republicans, and that is, boy, do they all like winning elections. I mean, nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. So they always end up going where the votes are. And so it's our job at the Environmental Voter Project, and it's our job collectively, those of us who care deeply about the climate and environmental movements, to dramatically increase the number of environmentalists who vote. Because politicians always have to go to where the votes are. It's just the brutal arithmetic of how democracy works. Either you get enough votes or you don't get to be a politician. So this is what we do and how we do it at the Environmental Voter Project. If you would like more information, you can go to our website, environmentalvoter.org, at the About tab, and we go into much more detail about how we identify and then mobilize these voters. I just want to close this very brief introduction before we get to our Arizona data by talking a little bit about our results. We measure our impact in 2 ways. The first one was the randomized control trial that I mentioned to you earlier. What this is let's say we identify 1 million low propensity climate voters in Florida. Before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly remove about 20%, set aside about 200,000, put them in a control group, and never talk to them. Then the remaining 80 to 85%, that's what's called our treatment group. These are the people who we canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to, all with this souped up behavioral science informed messaging. Then the election happens. And then a few months after that, voter files are updated and we can see how many low propensity environmental voters in our control group voted and compare it to how many voted in our treatment group. And the great thing about taking this approach is that enables us to isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Because we all know, we're talking about Arizona tonight, right? We all know that millions, maybe even billions of dollars will be spent in Arizona this fall. And if you're anything like me, you want to know for sure if your individual efforts or if our organizational efforts are having an impact, even in the midst of all of that static and all that other money that's being spent. And that's what these randomized control trials allow us to do. It allows us to measure with statistical significance when we are solely responsible for increasing turnout. And I'll just let you know, just since 2020, so just the last 3.5 years of elections, we've mobilized voters in over 900 different elections, and we probably increased turnout among our targets in all of them. But probably isn't good enough for us. That's why we run these randomized control trials. And what we know is in that those that were big enough that we could measure statistical significance, we could measure if we were having a non-random impact on turnout while controlling for what all other organizations were doing, we were able in 2020, and 21, and 22, and 23 to have some really extraordinary results, where we saw that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout by as much as 1.8 percentage points in general elections, as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 5.7 percentage points in local elections. And these might not sound like big numbers to some of you, but this is everything in politics. Arizona, in the last presidential election, was decided by 0.3 percentage points. So you better believe these numbers are a big, big deal. And we're enormously proud of them. And all of you who have funded or volunteered for our work in the past should be enormously proud of them. The final metric by which we measure our impact is not an election-specific metric like this, but rather a longer-term metric. Since we launched, now at the end of 2015, we have slowly expanded into 19 states. So we launched in 2015, and then all throughout 2016, we had a one-city pilot program in Boston, Massachusetts, where I live. Then we slowly expanded to 5 states, then 6, then 12, then 15, then 17, and now we're in 19 states. And every single time we spoke to a unique individual, low propensity climate voter, encouraging them to vote, we tagged them in our voter file. Now, some of those people we've spoken to many times. Some of them we only spoke to once. Some of them we've spoken to dozens of times because we're still trying to turn them into better voters. But what I can tell you is that as of about 6 weeks ago, we had spoken to 10.5 million unique individuals. Unique individuals. All of whom, remember, by definition, are pretty awful voters or we wouldn't have been talking to them to begin with, right? Well, as of 6 weeks ago, when we looked at their public voting histories, we saw that over 1.8 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. They had become such consistent voters that if you were running for dog catcher or library trustee, you would look in the voter file and you'd say, whoa, that person's going to vote. I better go talk to them. Better poll them to figure out what issues they care about too. This is the metric of which we are most proud, because this gets at consistent wielding of political power up and down the ballot in a way that'll really start changing policymaking. Now, I do want to say one thing. This, as a reminder, is different from the previous metric, the randomized control trial. I cannot claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.8 million non-voters into super voters. I can claim that for those previous randomized control trials. We're probably not solely responsible for turning these 1.8 million non-voters into super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible. No one else has come even close to being involved in 1,960 different elections since we launched. We are the only group doing all of this voter turnout work, even in the smallest of elections. All right. If you want more information about our results, we've got so many reports, so many of these randomized control trials written up, and I encourage you to go to our environmentalvoter.org/results page. All right, without further ado, let's jump into Arizona. We've got a ton of data for you. When we look at these predictive models that I just told you about, these super environmentalists that we've identified in Arizona, we've discovered a lot of really interesting things that we want to share with you. But first, let me give you some context. So we've identified 229,000 of these low propensity climate voters. These are the people we are targeting. And that's after we've already set aside a control group, by the way. So how big is that population? What does 230,000 mean in a state like Arizona? Well, in 2020, only 3.4 million ballots were cast. So this is a pretty large chunk of what will end up being likely voter turnout. And I'm sure I don't need to remind any of you on this webinar right now that Arizona was the single closest state in the nation in 2020. It was determined by a 10,457 vote margin. So the number of people we have individually identified in Arizona as registered super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote is so large that it is more than 20 times larger than the margin of victory in Arizona 3.5 years ago. That's an enormous pool of potential political power. All right. Arizona has an enormous number of important elections. The stakes are huge in Arizona this year. It is not only going to be crucially important for the presidential election with their electoral college votes, 11 electoral college votes. It also has a really tight US Senate race. There are at least 2 competitive congressional districts, and I'll go over all the congressional districts in a second, but there are 2 congressional districts that like all of the handicappers agree on. Some of the others throw in some others. Not to mention, Arizona's state Senate and state House of Representatives are literally as close as you can get. As close as you can get, which I will also show you in a little bit. Moreover, if that ain't enough for you, if both houses of the state ledge, the US Senate and the White House being on the line all in Arizona isn't enough for you, they also will almost definitely have enough certified signatures to qualify for a statewide ballot measure, establishing a fundamental right to an abortion. In other words, pretty much any voter in Arizona this fall, when they pull their ballot, they are going to be voting on 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 crucially important, close, competitive elections. This might be the highest leverage play out there for volunteers and donors. Pennsylvania's pretty darn close, but oh my gosh, is this a high leverage play? Because every vote, every non-voter we turn into a voter is going to impact everything. The White House, the Senate, the House, the state Senate, the state House, women's rights, human rights, so much. In addition to having the general election on November 5th, Arizona's state primary is coming up on August 6th. This is so important. Not because August 6th is going to have a bunch of crucially competitive races, but this is an opportunity to speak to these voters ahead of the static-filled craziness of October and November. August 6th is a precious opportunity, and I'm going to get into a little bit more about this later, for those of us in the habit-changing business. We feel like if we can spend 20-25% of our budget in August talking to these 230,000 non-voters, we'll be able to convert them at 1/4, 1/5 the cost of what it will take us to convert them from non-voters to voters this fall. And that's a crucially important opportunity. All right, before we get into more information about these important races, we're going to get into some polling data and some of the sort of geopolitics at play here. I want to tell you a little bit more about these low propensity environmental voters we've identified in Arizona. So I'd like you to look at the bottom here, this chart at the bottom. And how about you start way at the bottom here, this bottom row here that says reg voters, what that is a demographic breakdown of all registered voters in Arizona. So the way you read this chart is that 7.7 that you see there. What that means is 7.7% of all registered voters in Arizona are between the ages of 18 to 24. Next box, 18.5% of registered voters are 25 to 34. And you can see we get into sex demographic breakdowns and race demographic breakdowns. I thought this demographic breakdown of registered voters was important to provide to you because it gives you a baseline. It gives you a context to think about when I start telling you about these low propensity environmental voters who we're trying to turn out at the Environmental Voter Project. All right, so let's talk about them, okay? That's this next row that says LPEVs, low propensity environmental voters. Now, to be clear, this is a subset of registered voters because we're only targeting already registered voters. Already registered, they just need that behavior change, just need that nudge. All right, well, what's the first thing you might notice? Look at that. 80% of these low propensity environmental voters are under the age of 35. So they are disproportionately young. But let me provide some context. Oh, and you can compare that to registered voters, right? You see only 26% of registered voters are below 35 in Arizona, yet 80% of these low propensity environmental voters. What I don't have the time to go through with you this evening is comparing that to what we see in other states. And the truth is, this isn't dramatically different from what we see in other states. It's a little bit on the high end, but there are some states like Nebraska or Iowa where we see this getting close to 90% of these low propensity environmental voters are under the age of 35. This is a little bit above average. One thing that is unique, though, is normally there are more 18 to 24-year-olds than we see here. In Arizona, it's really interesting that it's much more heavily skewed to the 25 to 34-year-olds. And this is something that maps onto a lot of broader political ideology polling that we're seeing. And that is that 18 to 24-year-olds are often more conservative, on average, than 25 to 34-year-olds are, especially among men. 18 to 24-year-old men are much more conservative than what we were seeing 4 or 8 years ago. All right. Another thing you might notice by these about these age demographic breakdowns is it's not as simple as the older you get, the less likely you are to care about climate. In fact, it bumps up there among people 65 and older. And that's something that we not only see among low propensity environmental voters, but if we put vote propensity to the side and just look at people who care deeply about climate, that number is even higher. In fact, we recently came out with a study. Ren, if you have access to it, maybe you can put it in the chat. We recently came out with a study called Gray is the New Green, where we highlighted how in all of our states, actually in all but one of our states, we weren't able to get the data for Alaska. We've noticed that people 65 and older are now the second largest age group of people who list climate as their top priority, right after 18 to 34-year-olds. It's just a really interesting thing that cuts against, I think, a lot of popular wisdom. Okay. Sex demographic breakdowns are not as helpful in Arizona as they are in other states. You'll see there's a lot of unknown data here. That's because Arizona doesn't make voter sex data available in their public voter files. And so we have to source that data. I say we, our voter file company has to source that data from private data vendors. And there's a lot of just incomplete data out there. And so you'll see this demographic breakdown isn't as helpful as it could be in other states. And then when you look at the racial breakdown, you'll notice a few things. First, 70% of registered voters in Arizona are white, but fewer than 50% of our targets are white. So our targets are actually a majority people of color in Arizona. that is largely driven by disproportionate representation among Black voters, AAPI voters, and Native American voters. You'll see Black voters are twice as prevalent in our target population as they are among all registered voters in Arizona. Native Americans are 3.5 times as prevalent in our target population as they are in the baseline of registered voters. But you'll see AAPI and Hispanic voters are also disproportionately represented. The way this differs from some other states is in some of our other states, especially Florida, Pennsylvania, Georgia, to a lesser extent, Texas, Hispanics are no longer disproportionately represented in our target population. Hispanics are becoming much more conservative in certain parts of those states. That's either not happening or happening less slowly or happening less consistently in Arizona. Another thing that's a little different here is Asian American and Pacific Islander voters, although they are disproportionately represented in our target population in Arizona, it's not as disproportionate as what we see in some other states. They are really, really popping as maybe the racial and ethnic group, collection of racial and ethnic groups that cares most about climate and the environment. Okay, so that's a snapshot of the type of person we're talking about here when we say low propensity environmental voters. They are more likely to be young than old, although obviously there's a lot of nuance there. They are more likely to be people of color than white, although again, there's lots of nuance there. And that's really driven a lot by Native American, Black, and AAPI voters in Arizona. All right, let's get into where these targets are and where they could possibly be the most impactful. There are 9 congressional districts in Arizona. You'll see them all listed here. You'll see a partisan lean column. What this means is if you take the last 4 federal elections, average them, weighting the 2 recent ones more than the 2 less recent ones, what this means is R+2 means that that district, the 1st congressional district, right here, on average, will vote 2 points more Republican than all the other congressional districts in the country, than the average of those congressional districts. A D+24, that means it leans 24 points Democratic compared to the average from the last 4 federal elections. So you'll see there are some really gerrymandered districts in Arizona, although to be honest, it's a lot less gerrymandered than many other states. The 2 most competitive districts are the 1st, right here, David Schweikert's district, and the 6th, right here, Juan Ciscomani's district. So both of them are represented by Republicans. Both have slight Republican leans. Now, many of you are probably thinking, well, what about Greg Stanton? Yeah, it looks like that should be really competitive, right? That's this district right here that is anchored in part in Phoenix. Greg Stanton is a former city councilor in Phoenix and the former mayor. There are a few handicappers who consider this to be a competitive district, but not all of them. It's not as consistently viewed as competitive. Now, what you can see is we are targeting enormous numbers of these low propensity environmental voters in these important districts. Over 23,000 in the 1st, over 32,000 in the 4th, over 21,000 in the 6th. In other words, these voters that we're going to be mobilizing are in places where they can really, really make a difference. All right, let's move a little bit deeper into state legislative races. We don't have enough time to dig into all of these races, but what I can say is there are probably about 6 or 7 competitive state Senate races, almost twice as many state representative races. And as you can see here, it is about as close as you could get. There are 31 Republicans in the state House and 29 Democrats. There are 16 Republicans in the state Senate and 14 Democrats. It could be very easy for Governor Hobbs in Arizona to wake up after the election and realize that she's going to have much, much larger Republican majorities to work against than she does now. It could also be easy for her to wake up the day after Election Day and realize that in one of the most purple states in the nation, Democrats have a trifecta and can push through a whole lot of legislation. We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen, but we know, as I alluded to earlier, that this is probably the most high leverage opportunity state for you as a donor and you as a volunteer in 2024 because of its impact on the US Senate, because of its impact on the White House, because of its impact on the United States House of Representatives, and because of its impact in the state Senate and the state House. Another thing that I want to bring up. At the Environmental Voter Project, we communicate with voters in 5 different ways. We do volunteer calls, volunteer postcarding. As a staff, we do direct mail campaigns. As a staff, we do digital ad campaigns. And then there's a 5th thing, and that's volunteer door-to-door canvassing. We only do door-to-door canvassing in 4 cities across the entire country. These are our canvassing hubs, and we've chosen them because these are the 4 places where there is an absurd amount of what's called canvassable density, which means we not only have targets, but they are canvassable. In other words, you can reach them. They're not in like a high rise or a gated community or something like that. And it's dense. They're close to each other. When you're door-to-door canvassing, you don't want to knock on one door, talk to a voter, and then walk a mile to the next person. Those 4 places that we do door-to-door canvassing in the country are Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Austin, Texas, and Tucson, Arizona. Yet another reason why Arizona is so important to us at the Environmental Voter Project is not just because we've identified almost 230,000 of these low propensity environmental voters, not just because it is such a crucially important state up and down the ballot, but also because we can use the single most effective form of voter turnout work, which is door-to-door canvassing, in the 2nd largest city in the state, and that's Tucson. That is a tool that we don't have in many other states. It's just not efficient to knock on doors in many other places. But in Tucson, it is. And you can see some of the density. And this obviously isn't 15,000 dots here. You'll see up here, we've identified over 27,000 targets. 15,000 of them are in canvassable density. So they're easy to access and near other people who are easy to access. A huge, huge opportunity for us, and why, again, we need your support financially and your volunteer support. All right. Before we get to the Q&A, I just want to give you a snapshot. Many of you are probably already aware of this, but of where we are in the presidential and US Senate races. This is taken from the website 538.com. They do a really good job aggregating high quality polls and then averaging them out. You'll see that currently Trump has, in an average of high quality polls, a 4.1 percentage point lead over Biden in Arizona. Kennedy is down at 10.1 percentage points. This has been fairly consistent. It used to be a little bit bigger margin up here. It's been fairly consistent. Fairly consistent. You'll also notice if you add all this up, there's about 10% still on the sidelines making up their mind. If you dig into the crosstabs of a lot of these polls, you'll also realize that a lot of Kennedy's support is very, very weak. I would not expect that number to stay where it is. The US Senate race is different. Now, there haven't been enough high quality polls for 538 to average these out yet. And so instead, we're just providing the list of most recent high quality polls that they have. You'll see that the Democrat Ruben Gallego is consistently ahead in these polls. Sometimes it's within the margin of error, sometimes it is beyond it. I would not take that most recent poll as an indication of a trend. It could be the beginning of a trend. I think it's more likely that it's an outlier. But when you see the average of these polls, almost all of which are likely voter polls, although some are registered voter polls, you'll see it's a different story from the presidential race. And Ruben Gallego, the Democrat, is a little bit ahead. But still, you've got a lot of undecideds here. A lot of undecideds. All right. Hopefully you now have a pretty good idea of the stakes, of the opportunities, and how we at the Environmental Voter Project are uniquely positioned to take advantage of those opportunities and really, really take advantage of the high stakes that are at play in Arizona. And so we're going to get to a little bit on our budget and then to our Q&A. But while you're thinking about that, I would like all of you to consider getting involved in one or all of these three ways. First, make a donation. Donate to support our work. Ren will put a link in the chat. All donations made through that link will go directly to our work in Arizona. All donations help. Big donations help more. And I want to remind you, there is no limit on how much you can donate to the Environmental Voter Project. And I'll get into it in the next slide, but our budget for this state just over the next 5 months is $900,000. And I want you to give generously. I'm not asking this as a favor. We're not asking for charity. We're asking you to invest in your values. You care deeply about the political power of the climate movement, and you care deeply about addressing the climate crisis and the democracy crisis at this crucially important moment in time. And Arizona is everything in 2024. So please invest in your values, invest in what we have proven we can do, which is dramatically increase turnout in states like Arizona. Second thing, if you would like to volunteer for our work mobilizing these voters, you don't need any experience. Sign up online. You can go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved. You'll find phone banks to sign up for. You'll find canvassing opportunities to sign up for. And although we currently don't have any postcarding opportunities, those will open up again in probably a few weeks. And then finally, if you would like me to present over Zoom to some of your friends, I promise I'll go into more detail about the Environmental Voter Project and what we do and all that at the beginning rather than breeze over it. I would love to do that. I would love to meet your friends. I'd love to tell them about our work and then ask them if they would support it as well. If you're interested in that, please email me at nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org or info@environmentalvoter.org. Finally, before we get to the Q&A, I do just want to remind you about our budget here. We have a $900,000 budget for Arizona. That might seem like a big number to some of you. It might seem like a small number to some of you. To put that in context, remember, we're only targeting 230,000 of these really special climate first voters who we know so much about turning from non-voters into super voters. If you were to expand that 230,000 to say the size of a congressional race, or let's say the size of a US Senate race, that would be like having a $16 or $17 million budget for a US Senate race. So it would be one of the better or best funded US Senate races around. This is spending almost $4 per target voter, which is a lot, but we are convinced that that's not even at our point of diminishing returns. We could even spend a little bit more before we start losing efficiency. We will be door-to-door canvassing from May to November. We will be running digital ads for the upcoming primary. We will also be doing volunteer postcards and phone campaigns for the upcoming primary. And then we will be throwing everything at the general election: digital ads, door-to-door canvassing, phones, and direct mail. So again, please, please give generously. And I am really happy we've got a good amount of time to answer any questions you have. So as Ren readies to throw some questions to me, I will just remind everybody, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Maybe you've already done so, and Ren will send them my way. So what do we got, Ren?
Like Nathaniel mentioned, thank you again for putting the questions in the Q&A. To get us started, we have a question from Anand. Anand said, my question is, are you willing to experiment with changing your approach to increase your success, especially if your results diminish? In other words, are you going to keep honing it if needed, or is the approach you have developed it forevermore?
Really, really great question, Anand. We are always testing new messages. So maybe you didn't realize this, Anand, but you're going to make Ren's fingers get really busy right about now. Ren, could you put links to our recent webinars on successful voter turnout messaging, and also the one about our unsuccessful voter turnout messages in the chat? So, Anand, we are always testing new messages. We are always trying to get better, or we worry about the same things you do. Just because something has worked in the past doesn't mean that it will continue to work. And so if you go to our YouTube page, you'll see a whole bunch of webinars about recent and not so recent messaging experiments. What Ren just put in the chat was one from just about a month ago, I think, on experiments that we ran just last fall, because we wanted to make sure that some of our previous assumptions still held true, and we wanted to test some new messages that might be particularly good this year. She also put in the chat unsuccessful messaging experiments. A lot of organizations want to hide their failures, not us. We take a very scientific approach to this stuff. We want to be honest with you about our successes, and we want to be honest with you about the stuff that is not successful. And yeah, sometimes, no matter how much we study behavioral economics and behavioral psychology and behavioral sociology, we will test a new message and it doesn't increase turnout at all. And we want to share that with you so that you can get an idea for how we think and how rigorously we treat this stuff. But also we want to share it to other people in our space and allies so that they know, oh, the Environmental Voter Project tried this like interesting approach and it didn't work. Maybe we shouldn't try that. They already did. We want folks to learn from us. So yeah, we are always open to doing that. The one caveat to that is, in order to test individual messages, you need to clear the field of all other interventions. So for instance, let's say we want to test a particular digital ad, or test two digital ad messages against each other and a control group. Well, we can't do that if we're also sending direct mail and door-to-door canvassing and phone calls to those same voters. And so in order to test particular messages, we have to get rid of all the other types of voter contact in that particular election. That is not something we are interested in doing this November for a whole bunch of reasons, the biggest of which is it's probably the highest stakes set of elections any of us have ever experienced in our entire lives. So we will not be reducing our voter contact interventions this fall so that we can experiment this fall. But we did a whole ton of experimenting last year. We're doing experimenting right now in elections throughout the year so that we can learn from them and use it this fall. And then we'll be right back to doing more experiments next year. We are like a full-time field laboratory. And again, I encourage you to go to environmentalvoter.org/results. And at the bottom, you'll see I mean, it's probably close to 20 different reports now where we go through on a sort of conceptual level, the type of behavioral science that we're using, and then we get into the actual randomized control experiments of which stuff works and which stuff doesn't. Really, really good question.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Anon replied, cool, thanks. I just donated to you. Thanks for your hard work. Awesome. The second question we have is, you mentioned this in slide number 4. What does the RCT allow EVP to do, and why does this matter so much?
Really, really great question. So RCT stands for randomized control trial, for those of you who don't know. What randomized control trials allow us to do is isolate what our sole impact is on turnout while controlling for what all other groups do. So for instance, let me provide some context here. Let's say you'd never heard of randomized control trials before. And I said to you, hey, we're targeting 230,000 low propensity environmental voters in Arizona. And we think we're really smart. And so you should work with us to turn them into voters. And then after the election, we look at voter files and we say, you know what? 80,000 of them voted. And remember, like none of them were supposed to vote. So that means we made 80,000 voters. Oh my gosh, we're amazing. Congratulations. But what would you think if I said that? You'd probably think, no, Nathaniel, you didn't make 80,000 voters. You don't know if you were solely responsible for making all of those people vote. Maybe that was some other group, or maybe that was the billions of dollars that were spent from presidential campaigns mobilizing voters. You can't take credit for 80,000 of your targets voting just because maybe you gave them a call or sent them some mail pieces. And you would be right to say that. The way that we try to overcome that is with what's called a randomized control trial. And so what this does is, in Arizona, we've identified about 270,000 of these low propensity environmental voters. We have set 40,000 of them aside. We have randomly set them aside in a control group, and we never talk to that control group. The remaining 230,000, they're the ones that we canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to. Then the election happens. And if you don't know this already, please remember a very important fact. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. And so after the election, when public voter files are updated, we can compare turnout in the control group of low propensity environmental voters we did not talk to turnout in the treatment group, which is the low propensity environmental voters we did talk to. And as long as that initial separation process was truly random and the numbers are big enough to achieve what's called statistical significance, we don't need to get into statistics, but I'm sure you can figure out that if you use really small numbers, well, then it's really easy for random weird things to take place. But if you use really big numbers, then you can really isolate what you were solely responsible for. And what these RCTs, these randomized control trials, then enable us to do is say that increase in turnout was solely due to our work. Because even if the Biden campaign spends $1 billion mobilizing climate voters, well, we've controlled for that. Unless they hack into our system and decide to only talk to people in our treatment group, but nobody in our control group, we have controlled for that. This is what a randomized control trial allows us to do. It allows us to measure our impact with real rigor. And it also, getting back to the previous question, allows us to measure which messages work best with which subgroups of these voters. So really, really good question. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathaniel. All right, we have 2 more questions, and I'll ask them right now to close out to the Q&A session. One is, how partisan is climate change as an issue? And second, why do you think there's such a big difference between Democratic support in Arizona between the presidential race and the US Senate race?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. So great question. So let me take the second one first here. Uh, you probably noticed that Biden is down by about 4 points in the average of polls in Arizona, yet the Democrat, Ruben Gallego, if you were to average it, is probably up by 5 or 6 points over the Republican. This split ticket voting, where you vote for one Democrat and one Republican, is extraordinarily rare. And I bring that up to say, I don't expect that to hold true for the next 5+ months. Just to give you an idea of how rare split ticket voting is, if you look at the last two presidential elections, 2020 and 2016, so the last two times where we've had a presidential election and people running for Senate, well, 67 US Senate races have happened. Do you know how many of those US Senate races actually had a split ticket result? One. One. Only one of them. That was Susan Collins in Maine in 2020. It's the only one where the presidential party that won the state was different from the party that won the US Senate race. Now, that obviously 67 is a limited data set. I'm not going to go to the bank with that. My guess is we'll see a little bit more split ticket voting this year, but I would not expect that to hold. I think it is likely that something changes. Either Biden starts picking up steam on Trump or Gallego starts losing it, because I find it hard to believe, looking at the last two sets of presidential and US Senate races, that 8 or 9% of the likely voter electorate wants to vote for a Democratic senator and a Republican president. Some of them will, but I'm pretty confident that number is going to get smaller. And I'm not the only person who thinks that. And this is unique to Arizona. There are some other states where we see this, but there are clearly a whole bunch of likely voters who want to vote for Democratic policies in Arizona. And so I expect that gap to shrink, particularly as RFK Jr.'s support shrinks. The other question, how partisan is climate change? Well, I think there are two important ways to look at this. One is, if you're just looking at people who would prefer government action on climate, that is broadly bipartisan. A large majority of Democrats, a large majority of independents, and a small majority, but still a majority of Republicans support government action to address the climate crisis. So in that way, climate change is very bipartisan. Another important way to look at it, though, is looking at people who list climate as their number one priority. People who list climate as their number one priority, and my guess is this is what this questioner was trying to get at, in many ways, that's probably the most partisan group of people out there. And just to give you one example, because we're running short on time, if you look at what I believe is the most recent Economist YouGov tracking poll, 20% of Biden supporters list climate change or the environment as their number one priority. It's actually the largest issue constituency group among Biden supporters, 20%. Do you know how many Trump supporters list climate as their top priority? 0. So these climate first voters are breaking 20-0 for Biden over Trump. How partisan is that? Well, to give you some context, Biden is only getting 88% of registered Democrats. The other 12% are either going for Trump or third parties or haven't made up their mind yet. So one way to put it is that climate first voters break harder for Joe Biden than even registered Democrats do, by a pretty big margin. And so it's really interesting to bear salience in mind. There are a lot of people who care deeply about the climate crisis, and that's awesome. That is good. That's where we want it to be. But when you look at people who view it as really, really important, view it as their top priority, that is not, for better or for worse, a bipartisan group. All right, we went a minute or two over. Thank you for your patience. I'm going to close now, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say one more time, please, please donate and donate generously. There is a link in the chat right now. You can open it up. You can also donate by wire transfer, by stock transfer, or by check. Ren, if you could put the donation information document link in the chat, that's how all of you can find that. And I want to remind you, we are now exactly 24 weeks from Election Day. 24 weeks, that's 168 days exactly, where you will be sitting down on your couch watching election returns roll in. Polls will have already closed in Georgia. They will have just closed in Pennsylvania. They will be getting close to closing in, oh no, they will have already closed in North Carolina, and will probably be an hour left to vote in Arizona. You don't want to have any regrets. You don't want to be sitting down watching those election returns roll in and wish that you could have done more. So please donate generously, and reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you so much for being involved in our work. And thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening. Take care, everybody.